So Esther 2 verse 19 to Esther 3 verse 6. Even after all the young women had been transferred to the second harem, and Mordecai had become a palace official, Esther continued to keep her family background and nationality a secret. She was still following Mordecai's directions, just as she did when she lived in his home. One day, as Mordecai was on duty at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthana and Teresh, who were guards at the door of the king's private quarters, became angry at King Xerxes and plotted to assassinate him. But Mordecai heard about the plot and gave the information to Queen Esther. She then told the king about it and gave Mordecai credit for the report. When an investigation was made and Mordecai's story was found to be true, the two men were impaled on a sharpened pole. This is all recorded in the book of the history of King Xerxes' reign. Sometime later, King Xerxes promoted Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, over all the other nobles, making him the most powerful official in the empire. All the king's officials would bow down before Haman to show him respect whenever he passed by, for so the king had commanded. But Mordecai refused to bow down or show him respect. Then the palace officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why are you disobeying the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, but still he refused to comply with the order. So they spoke to Haman about this to see if he would tolerate Mordecai's conduct, since Mordecai had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learnt of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. So, of course, we led the story last week with Esther winning the beauty contest and becoming the queen, being the one woman from probably hundreds chosen by the king to be his queen in the place of the deposed Queen Vashti. Esther has now become the queen. There's been a great celebration in her honour. But again, we see at the beginning of this passage Esther's humility. She's not just humble when she's in a lowly position and teachable and willing to listen, willing to learn. She's even remains humble when she gets success and fame and adulation and a very exalted position. And that says a lot about her. Because a lot of people are quite good with the humility when everything's down there. But when they become celebrities, or they become famous or popular, or they have suddenly great influence or wealth, the humility often takes a big knock. How often do we read and hear of people who have come into such fame and fortune, and they've basically forgotten those who put them there. They've forgotten those who actually loved them and cared for them and were there with them and lived with them when they weren't known. And then all the hangers-on, the sycophants and everyone, and they get a new friendship group. Esther, it seems, has not had her head turned by this. She's still willing to be humble. And again, she's a great example that we can see here. Even after everything's finished, all the women are being put into this harem of the concubines of the king, and she is absolutely in place with a crown on her head. And well, she's basically the first lady, isn't she? She's the main woman in the kingdom. She is the king's special, most favoured person. But yet it tells us here she still was following Mordecai's instructions. Remember, she owed Mordecai just about everything. He was her cousin, her older cousin, but he's basically her adopted father. He looked after her because her parents had died. And Esther doesn't forget him. She still subjects herself to him, even though her position is higher than his. He has some sort of position in the kingdom. He seems to be some sort of palace official. He seems to have some sort of duty there at the king's gate. He wouldn't have been allowed to get close enough to the king's residence if he didn't have some position. So something's been given to him. Whether Esther's influence, we don't know, but she put in a good word for him and given him that position. We don't know that, but we do know that Esther is a lot higher than he is. But yet she still defers to her older relative. She still remembers where she came from. She still remembers that He's wise and worth listening to. And again, what an example of teachableness, of humility, and of remembering where she's come from, and not letting the power and the status go to her head. It's an example for us all. You know, we find out a lot about ourselves when we struggle, but we also find a lot about ourselves when things go well. How do we respond in those times? Does the head expand? Because it can do, can't it? It can easily expand. And then we think more of ourselves and forget who we are, where we've come from, and the fact that we owe lots of people for what they've done for us. Esther does not lose that. She's still willing to listen to Mordecai's advice and to take the wisdom that he offers. But Mordecai's position here, we find, saves the day. Because what happened is that two of the eunuchs of the king who actually have access to the king's private quarters. So eunuchs, without going into too much detail, are basically castrated men. The reason they're castrated, well, there's probably a couple of reasons. One, that they wouldn't harbour their own ambitions. The other is that the king could then trust them around the women of his harem. They're not going to do it. It's as vulgar as that. And so kings in those days, and sometimes queens, would have eunuchs because they knew where they were. Absolutely. But two of them have got so angry with the king that they want to kill him. And given that they are there guarding his private quarters, he's incredibly vulnerable to them. Very vulnerable. At any point they're just going, that's it, end of King Xerxes. And how often have we seen when there's been coups, there's been deposings of kings or emperors or presidents, that it's their security detail that does the wicked thing, isn't it? A rogue security person who's got access to that public figure is quite often the one that turns on them and assassinates them. And this was about to happen, except for Mordecai, because he's either heard the gossip that's going around the thing, and he's in his ear to the ground, he's realised what's happening, or I think this is possibly more likely, they've told him about it. Because they have imagined, these guys have imagined that Mordecai might side with them. He might assist them in their cowardly act of treachery. Because if you think about it, these guys are going to kill the king. If they're not successful, they're dead. If they're successful, they're probably dead as well, aren't they? So I'm assuming that some of their plotting is how do we get away? How do we make ourselves scarce? Because we've had it. We're not going to become, eunuchs never became the king, so they're not going to get that position. And how are they going to escape with their lives? Or is it just a suicide mission? Maybe they're that angry they don't care anymore. But they, it seems, have tried to enlist Mordecai. Mordecai now has a choice. Three things he can do. He can either assist them in killing the king and be part of their plot. He can say nothing and let things take their course, or he can stop it. And he chooses the third. And there's all sorts of reasons for choosing the third. Maybe he loves to the king. Maybe he knows he owes him a bit. But of course, the big thing is that the king's wife is, of course, his cousin, his fellow Jew. And Mordecai must know that if Xerxes dies, the influence on the king will be lost. He's not going to be the same again. This is a peculiar thing that's happened. An amazing thing that's happened. Although God is not mentioned in Esther, we can see that God is engineering all these events right through the book. And Mordecai knows that Esther's got the influence of the king. We're not going to get that chance again. We need to get him quick before the king loses his life. So he lets Esther know. Whether he actually had full access to Esther, we don't know. But anyway, he gets the message to her. She then informs the king. And the king makes the investigation. Now, some of you already know that it was quite tricky to go and see the king. You were only allowed to go and see the king if he had actually requested your presence. But maybe Esther was invited to see him anyway around that time. But also, I think it probably is an exemption if you go up to the king and say, "Excuse me, king, I'm sorry to disturb you. I know this isn't protocol, but your life is at risk." I think the king's going to let you off for such an interruption. And he hears this, the investigation is made, The men are found guilty and they're executed. The sharpened pole, without going into too much detail, I don't think refers to the execution as to the fact that that's where their heads were stuffed, as a warning to everyone against sedition, against treachery, against betrayal, and against laying hands on the king. That was not unusual, sadly, in those brutal days. And then everything is recorded in the history books of the kingdom. Esther, it must be said, will have found favour with the king because she's told him. That would have put him even higher up in her estimation. She's also let him know about Mordecai, telling her. And that gets recorded. But nothing else seems to happen. The king gets his revenge. The men are swiftly and brutally executed. And then it seems it's forgotten about. Of course, at the right time, things will be remembered. But as we come into chapter 3, we find that events take another turn, and we meet the final main character in the story of Esther, Haman. Haman is the chief villain. In fact, he's one of the nastiest people in the whole Bible by the look of it. He really is an unpleasant chap. And if we were to look at the dates here, and we get some dates for what happens around the time of Haman, we're probably 4 years after Esther has become queen, and about 8 years after Queen Vashti was deposed. That's the timeline for these events. And it's quite important, the timeline, because Haman gets exalted to a high position. He's an official in the kingdom with everyone else, and suddenly he becomes the first among equals. Suddenly he is basically second in command of the kingdom. In fact, he has more influence than Esther by a long way. He has the most influence of all. He a little bit reminds me of Joseph in Genesis with the Pharaoh. This man will have all the power in the kingdom and second to me. That's the sort of position Haman uses. But unlike Joseph, who used his position to actually rescue the world, Haman is going to use his position for death and destruction, revenge and a personal vendetta. And actually what he does leads to a lot of deaths, just not the way he wants it. That's as we come to the end of the story. But Haman has that power. It's also similar to a previous Persian king, Darius, who gave Daniel that sort of power. Again, used with wisdom, with godliness in the right way. Haman is here the complete opposite. Now we might wonder, why is Haman promoted to this? We don't see any particular qualities that would give him that position. And my guess is that Haman was quite articulate. He was very good at saying the right thing. And a tyrant, which we know Xerxes was, an egotistical tyrant, loves to have people around who say what they want to hear. Loves to have people around who will flatter him. And I imagine that Haman was quite silver-tongued in saying what the king desired to hear and to know about. And he was probably the chief bootlicker in the kingdom in terms of the king. And so the king flatters because of his ego. Thinks, yeah, this guy, he tells me everything I want to hear. Let's give him a high position, because I know he'll do what I want. And now again, that's the same. The king will want someone who will just do his every command without question. Haman is fitted for the job. But there's other things at hand here. There's other factors, I believe, at play. A couple of weeks ago, I alluded to the fact that the Persians had a great empire. It stretched in the east to the borders of India, the northeast up to Kazakhstan, in the northwest towards what's now Bulgaria and towards Romania, in the southeast down towards Libya, Egypt, Lower Egypt, what's called Libya at the time, what was called Ethiopia at the time was more like southern Egypt and northern Sudan. It was most of the known world. But there was one place which was the thorn in the flesh, Greece. Greece was the problem. Greece was a lot of actual city-states, some of whom had been made into vassal states for Persia. But a couple of them, when the emissaries from Persia came and said, look, just sign on the dotted line and we won't attack you anymore and you can just be subject to us, but we'll give you some autonomy. When some of the emissaries were sent from Persia to a couple of these city-states, they were executed on the spot. Can you imagine when that gets back to Persia, what's going to happen? And so Xerxes felt he had to subjugate Greece. He had to get his revenge for his officials being killed. And so he sent his soldiers out to war. And in fact, Xerxes in history is known mainly for the war with Greece. At this point, it's around 480 BC, around the time that Esther is in the harem wondering if she'll be chosen by the king. And sadly for Xerxes, the battle was a failure. Greece won, and the Persians went with their tails between their legs back in towards Susa. The invulnerability of that army now had a shadow cast over it. In fact, I would imagine it was the start of the decline of the Persian Empire. They were now not seen as insurmountable. Someone had actually fought them and won a victory. In fact, eventually Greece would take over. Eventually, a long time later. And when you're a dictator and things go wrong abroad, or things go wrong on the military field, you are under serious threat. Because people go, hang on, this guy's not as powerful as we thought. We're not sure where this guy's going. Has he really, I'm sure the blame for the army's defeat went to Xerxes. It was laid at Xerxes' feet. And I'm sure there were people thinking, we need to get rid of this guy. Things have not gone better since he came. Maybe someone could do a better job. And in those days, when someone was supposed, it usually ends with their life ending at the same time. And so I actually wonder, the plot on Xerxes' life by the eunuchs, I'm wondering if they were acting alone. I'm wondering if there was someone behind the scenes in the shadows was suggesting to them, you don't like the king, do you? Get rid of him. And if you get rid of him, someone powerful, I'm wondering, then I'll come in. I will pardon you and I will reward you. Suddenly the incentive for killing him becomes a lot greater. I'm, in a sense, making that up. I'm assuming things, but he's not beyond the realms of possibilities. This is what happens. So the king is under serious threat, politically and indeed to his own life. So he needs to make sure that he gets everyone on side. He needs to make sure that he strengthens his position. And it seems that Haman was a man of wealth, of influence, and had a lot of people around him. So it was politically expedient, I think, for him to promote Haman in this way. So I think this gives another reason for what's happening here. Often in the Bible there's things going on in the wider sphere that actually influence the story that we see on the ground level. So the king is in a weakened position. He needs to strengthen it quickly. Haman gets promoted. And he has this incredible influence and power now over the whole kingdom. Mordecai, as we can see, is not amused. Mordecai refuses to bow down to Haman like everyone else is supposed to do. Now, some commentators suggest that's because it's idolatry. I'm sorry, it isn't. If we go to see King Charles, if we go to see him for some award or whatever, or something, or previously Queen Elizabeth, we'd have to bow before them. It does not mean we're worshipping him. It's just a sign of authority. That's it. But Mordecai doesn't even want to respect him in this way. They think we can put idolatry in him. Why not? There could be all sorts of reasons, which I think Shane might look into a little bit more when he gives the talk next week. But one of them is, I believe that Mordecai knew what sort of person Haman was. He knew he'd flattered his way to the top. He knew how unpleasant he was, which we will see worked out as we go through this book. And Mordecai doesn't want any part of this. He clearly disagrees with the king's decision. He doesn't want to know, and he's not going to give Haman the time of day. And Mordecai refuses even to listen when people say, you better do this, because this is going to go bad for you. He refuses even at that point and at that pressure. At which point, the gossip of the kingdom goes very sour indeed, because these officials who have given Mordecai a chance now decide that they're going to tell on him to Haman. And this is going to cause, of course, major trouble. Because Haman, with his head in the air, probably hasn't even seen Mordecai down there. It's hard to what you even look at him. But of course, once he's heard that there's a slight and an insult on his character and he's being disrespected, next time he walks past Mordecai, he's looking right down. What's he going to do? Here's the test. And Mordecai does the same. And Haman's rage knows no bounds. Now it's interesting that at this point, Mordecai has let people know that he's a Jew. And I wonder about the wisdom of that. I don't know if it's wise or not. Because remember, he keeps telling Esther don't, and then he does different. And I do wonder about this. You know, Mordecai is God's man in this situation, but he's not perfect. Remember, we are dealing with people who aren't perfect. And I'm wondering if he made a bit of a mistake. You know, how often in our lives have we been in a conversation, whether at work or among friends or in church or among family, and we've let our tongues run on too long. And then you can't take it back, can you? You can't rewind it. It's dead. And you think, why did I say that? Why didn't I just shut up at that point, or that point, or that point, or that point? Instead I let it go, and I can't take it back. We've all done it. I'm sure we've all done it. I know I have. I'll start marrying it myself. And maybe he's been a bit unwise. Maybe he's got a bit complacent. Because if I'm Mordecai, I'm thinking the king owes me my life. Nothing will happen to me because the king owes me, owes me his life. So surely no one will do anything to me. But of course Mordecai has reckoned without the king's absolute self-centeredness. The king doesn't care about what's happened except I'm just going to kill the people who try to kill me. And then it's all been forgotten about. Of course it's going to be unearthed at the correct time. But Mordecai doesn't know that. All he knows is that he's made a stand, he's started to declare himself, he's assumed that he'll probably be okay, and then he's backfired incredibly badly. Because I'm guessing at worst, Mordecai thinks, well, Haman might put me to death. It'll cost me. At worst. But little does he know just how wicked and evil Haman is. Little does he know how far Haman will go with revenge. He said, actually, I don't want to just kill him, I'm going to take all his people out. And you can only imagine Mordecai's thoughts when he heard what plans were afoot. We can only imagine the horror. I've got my people into this. One, by saying I was a Jew. And secondly, by just refusing to give this guy the time of day, even if he doesn't deserve it, which clearly you can see he doesn't. But let's look at it on the other side. Because Mordecai is, of course, a far better person than Haman. We'll see that as we go through the book. How often when we do what's right, does it backfire on us? Quite often, isn't it? You do the thing of integrity, and you suffer for it. You do the right thing, you make the right call, you decide to be honest, because we should be honest in all things. And sadly, honesty in our society today doesn't pay. It doesn't. Think of insurance claims and things like that. Think of crimes, think of things like that, and the law courts. It seems that honesty really is not a wise move. Does that mean we shouldn't employ it? Of course not. We should employ it, because that is what we should do as disciples of Christ. But quite often we will do the right thing and then we'll suffer for it. And then that will be another test of our faith. How real is it? Are we willing to keep hold of the Lord? Are we willing to follow him and live lives of integrity even when it hurts? Even when it doesn't go well for us? I know a number of people as well, when they've made a commitment to Christ, they're then deciding, actually I'm going to live the right way before Jesus now. Because I've chosen for Jesus, I'm actually going to check out and evaluate my life. And that person may have decided to loosen some of their friendships. Maybe even to distance themselves from friends. Maybe to cut off relationships. Maybe boyfriend or girlfriend even, because they're worried about the implication. And then their lives don't seem to have gone very well, and that person says, actually, why was I choose for Jesus? It's not done me any good. And that's quite a hard thing to answer. You know, Mordecai's trying to do the right thing. Certainly his intentions were good, even if he possibly was unwise, which is open to interpretation. He certainly tried to do the right thing. And it backfired on him incredibly badly and caused danger to his whole people. And in those times, we've got to remember a number of principles. Firstly, Jesus talks a lot about the fact that we need to store our treasures in heaven, not on earth. Our primary focus, do we want the Lord's ultimate reward when we see him in glory? That must be our ultimate and primary focus. The second thing is to remember what Jesus says about discipleship. He says a number of things, but two of them are this. Are you willing to count the cost? Are you willing to count the cost? Because it could cost you everything. Are you willing to give your life up for my sake? Are you willing to lose it? Because your soul will be saved if you've chosen from it. And that ultimately is more important because it has eternal consequences. Are you willing to take up your cross daily and follow me? Are you willing to put your trust in me? Are you willing to make good on the commitment you made? Yeah, and I don't think it's an accident that one of the soil types in the parable of the sower, remember the seed goes into the soil, the seed is the gospel. One of them is the shallow soil. And the plant, the faith grows up fast. But then when persecution and trouble come, it dies because the person is shallow. They're only in it when it's good. We need to be in it when it's good and when it's bad. We need to remember that we need to hang on to Jesus, who went through the most awful time for you and me. We need to have that as our ultimate perspective. You know, and there are some people who are persecuted for their faith, and they won't be vindicated in this world. They'll literally die for their faith, and that's it. But you know what? In Revelation, it says these wonderful words about people who suffer tribulation. Whether we believe that's in a time in the future or that just relates in general to persecution. That is why they stand in front of God's throne and serve him day and night in his temple. He who sits on the throne will give them shelter. They will never again be hungry or thirsty. They will never be scorched by the heat of the sun. For the Lamb on the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of life-giving water, and God will wipe every tear from their eyes. It's Revelation 7, verses 15 to 17. Yeah, that's what we have to look forward to. We need to be storing up treasures in heaven. But you know, there are times when God does vindicate. And we should pray and trust that if we do the right thing, God will reward us. We may get some of that reward now, but ultimately we need to be looking to get that reward when we're in glory. Because of course the book of Esther hasn't finished. It is dark. It's dark in Mordecai's mind. It's certainly dark in Haman's heart, to say the least. You know what? Often the night is darkest just before the dawn. We need to remember that. When we're going through hard times, we need to trust that the Lord will be with us and he will take us through. You know, on Good Friday, it was physically dark, wasn't it? Remember, the sun was covered and darkness fell on the earth and Christ was on the cross. That darkness was physical, but it was nothing on the darkness and the despair of the disciples at that time. The one that they had followed as Lord, as teacher, as friend, has died. You know, I bet that there was a certain amount of them thinking, he's let us down. He's let us down. He's left us. Why didn't he do something? They may have even echoed what the chief priest said in mockery. He saved others, but he couldn't save himself. And they must be distraught, disillusioned, wondering why they bothered wasting their time. But Easter Sunday was around the corner. The light is never. We need to have our trust in the Lord, that he will take us through. You know, when we do the right thing and we suffer, know that the Lord is with you. Know that he went through worse and he will take us through. And yes, there will be some vindication in this earth, but ultimately we look to him who we will join in glory. And that's the ultimate reward of putting our trust in him. And we're going to remember more of that when Kath takes us through communion in a few minutes' time. But before we take communion, we're going to sing a song which reminds us that the cross wasn't the end. All heaven declares the glory of the risen Lord. Who can compare with the beauty